If you like my videos, please subscribe to the channel and click the like button if you like this video. I also have a Patreon, so if you're interested in supporting me that way, I'll link it in the video description. And the names that you see on the screen here are all of my current patrons. They support the channel in ways that you guys cannot believe, and they really keep me going. Without them, this channel wouldn't exist. Thank you guys. I also just recently set up a Discord server, so why don't you join it and we'll talk about some D&D. I'll link it in the video description as well. Welcome to the Twisted Tentacle Inn. I'm your innkeeper, and today we will be talking about Sorcerer level 5 spells. Level 5 spells are kind of an interesting group of spells. This level spells start to get a little bit more complicated, where they do more than one thing and can serve more than one function. A lot of them are control and utility spells, although most are control spells with some utility and damage built in. There are only 2 proper area of effect spells and a couple of single target damaging spells. Neither one is that good, and a couple of debuff spells. So level 5 spells are a little more complicated, so this is going to be a slightly longer video considering the amount of spells that are in it. So let's go ahead and get started. Animate Objects. This one is a really popular spell for 5th level. Some even say that it's overpowered or broken, and I think this spell is honestly pretty mediocre. It's a little bit better in Sorcerer, but not for the reasons that you think. If you've watched my videos, you know how I feel about summoning. There's very little in 5th edition that can impact your action economy more than summoning spells can. And even though this one is not exactly a summoning spell, it's one of the few spells that sorcerers get that can serve a very similar purpose to a summon, and that's why I say it's better in sorcerers, because it's really their only choice for summoning. So they definitely want to take an extra look at this spell before looking at any other 5th level spell because of that one reason. The spell can serve a limited number of utility functions, but honestly, it doesn't have a very good duration, so pretty much makes it a combat spell with a little tiny bit of utility built in. I find it funny that the text says, like, oh, you can issue a command, like guard the door, but what, are they going to guard the door for a minute and then deactivate? Who guards the door for 1 minute? Usually you're doing stuff for more time than that when you need someone to guard the door. Unless you're in the middle of a combat and trying to get away and you need the objects to guard the door. I just thought that was kind of funny. With this spell, you animate 10 tiny objects or 10 small objects, or you can do a combination of tiny, small, and then larger, like medium, large, or huge. And the bigger they get, the less tiny ones you can make, or the less number of objects you can make. But you can combine, so you can have like one huge object and a couple of tiny and a couple of medium, so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and look at the benefits of this spell and then kind of discuss what it can do, and we'll also talk about some of the major drawbacks of the spell. So definitely good that the objects can fly with hover. Anything that flies that is on your side is going to be very helpful, especially at this level where you'll probably be fighting flying creatures, or maybe trying to get to places that are hard to reach, right? So flying objects are always going to be handy. Now, you don't always get flying objects. If you're animating something that has legs or appendages like legs, like a chair, let's say, they're not going to be able to fly. So definitely don't go for those because you want these things to be flying. The objects also have a really good amount of hit points. The tiny and small ones have 20 hit points, which is not bad. And then the bigger ones get to like 80, which is fantastic. It only takes a bonus action to command the animated objects, so that's pretty good. The objects as a whole have great damage output. Individually, they don't do a whole lot of damage, but because you can get up to 10 tiny or small objects, combined 10 attacks dealing mediocre damage adds up to quite a bit of damage every single round consistently. And you can have multiple objects in place, so you can swarm something and just decimate them. And of course, having 10 items really boosts your action economy, and not to mention it boosts your party's defenses quite a bit, because the more creatures you have in play, that's more targets for the enemy to go after that are not you or the other soft party members. Now, what's not as good with this spell? There are no resistances or immunities for any of these creatures, so they're going to get, even though they have 20 hit points or whatever, those hit points are going to go very quickly. They're going to get charmed, they're going to get stunned, they're going to get frightened. Unfortunately, at this level, you're fighting a lot of creatures that can do that kind of stuff, and your animated objects are going to be completely useless against those types of attacks. Not to mention their saving throws, all of them across the board are terrible. All of their stats are really low. They have horrible saving throws, so if an enemy is throwing something at them that requires a saving throw, you can bet that they're going to fail their saving throw. So don't count on these animated objects to be extremely tanky per se. Another limitation is that you have to give the same command in a given round to all or some of your objects. So if you want some objects to guard you and attack anything that comes near you, and then you want some of them to go out and attack the creature that is further away, that's going to take 2 rounds of bonus actions to issue those 2 commands, because you can issue the one command to go attack, and then the following round you'll have to issue the command to the ones that are going to guard you. So if a creature happens to come near you, the ones that are guarding you are not going to be attacking them, because you need to issue that command separately. So keep in mind, that is a huge limitation that I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize with this spell. Also, the short duration of this spell makes it not ideal for utility, unfortunately. And then, of course, the objects don't have any appendages other than legs. And if they have legs, they suck because they can't fly. So you can't have your animated objects doing other things that some summoning spells can do, like giving healing potions to your allies, or grabbing a weapon that was disarmed off of an enemy, grappling enemies. That's a huge one. If you're standing in the back and you don't want creatures to get to you, a summoned creature can easily grapple something and hold them off of you, but your animated objects can't do that. Now, they can shove, so they can do that, but they can't grapple anything. So they also don't really have any other special abilities. They just have a basic attack. And so if you're fighting a creature that is immune or resistant to non-magical attacks, they're not going to be extremely effective against them, unfortunately. The damage is not that good, and if the creature has resistance to non-magical attacks, your damage output is going to be severely limited here. And if you choose tiny objects, the other limitation is you're fighting a lot of creatures at this level that do area of effect damage or area of effect debuffs, and your summoned objects are going to be decimated by these things if they're facing something that has that kind of an attack. So as you can see, this spell definitely has a lot of limitations. I just don't see why people think it's overpowered, honestly. There's all these things. Usually, like if you have a summoning spell, it may have 1 or 2 of these limitations that I mentioned, but not all of them. Definitely not. And then a lot more benefits. So if you're able to get other summoning spells as a sorcerer with your subclass, like if you are Aberrant Mind or Clockwork Soul, you're getting great summoning spells. Consider those before you consider this one, I think. I'm not saying this spell is bad. It's just perspective I want to give you on this one, because we need to judge this spell honestly and not just blindly say that it's broken or overpowered, because on paper it looks like you're dealing a ton of damage every round with it. It's not necessarily as good as you might think. Now, all that being said, combat is where this spell really excels. If you're fighting a creature with like single opponent attacks, having multiple creatures tank that damage is tremendous. I mean, so if you're fighting a creature that's attacking twice for like 15 damage each attack, it's going to take 2 attacks to kill 1 creature. So you literally mitigated that from hitting one of your other party members. And you have 10 of these creatures on the board. So this thing is going to be really busy trying to kill your animated objects. The 20 hit points is really nice because not a whole lot of creatures hit for more than 19 points. And therefore it'll take 2 full attacks to kill 1 animated object, even if they deal less damage. I mean, if a creature is dealing 7 points of damage, I mean, that's the 3 attacks that it's going to take to kill these things. So something that is really, really efficient with these is just tanking and keeping things busy while the rest of your party is not taking this damage. And of course, a lot of creatures have other debilitating effects and attacks. So like a Beholder's Gaze attacks, right? They paralyze, they disintegrate. Now it's going to be targeting the animated objects and not necessarily your party members. So you're mitigating all of these attacks from actually hitting your party. That is really, really big. And not to mention that you're attacking 10 times, which again, I'll reiterate, 10 attacks per round is awesome. I mean, it can really decimate an enemy if they're not resistant, because that is just a ridiculous amount of attacks that you're getting against a creature each round. And to top it off, you can still cast your spells every round using an action, because your creatures are attacking on their own with just a bonus action to command them. Now, one thing that I did mention earlier is that it's going to take several commands to split them up and do different things. So that's something to think about. You don't have a whole lot of options tactically for handling or managing your creatures. You're going to have to issue commands over several rounds if you want to do some really good tactical stuff with them, which is not ideal and probably isn't going to work as well. So when you cast this spell, I recommend going with like bigger, tougher animated objects when battling creatures with area of effect attacks. and a bunch of small or tiny ones in pretty much every other type of combat encounter. So even if your tiny objects are attacking enemies for just a bit of damage and absorbing attacks against the party, it's still a huge boost to the group. Let's be honest, it's a spell that I'll always consider specifically for a blaster type sorcerer. If you're specializing in control or buffs, this one might conflict with some of your spells because of the concentration requirement. So that is also something to keep in mind. For utility, there are some other uses, like you can rearrange furniture quickly in a room by animating it and having it rearrange itself, or you can set up a trap for someone by just having the objects animate themselves into a cool trap, or having boxes stack on top of each other so you can reach a hard to reach place. I mentioned earlier that the duration is pretty terrible, and honestly, extended spell is not going to help you out very much here. Extending the duration from 1 minute to 2 minutes, it's not really going to be that impactful, let's be honest. And it's not really going to make it that much more useful for utility or exploration. There really aren't too many metamagic options that work well with this spell, to be honest, and you really don't need it. The spell is good as it is, and for a sorcerer, it's great. And there's very little that's competing for options for summoning in a sorcerer, so this is going to be a great option for you. You can upcast the spell, but it doesn't really scale too well. At higher levels, creatures are getting tougher and more powerful and more resistant to things, and the fact that these things don't deal magical damage don't make it worthwhile to upcast to an 8th or 9th level spell, let's say. And getting 2 additional creatures for each spell level is really pretty bad, so I wouldn't do that. Cloudkill. This is another upgraded version of Fog Cloud in a way. This one deals damage to anyone who's in the cloud every single round. It has great range, a decent area of effect, but the poison damage at this level is really honestly an unfortunate choice. Not to mention, the spell provides a Constitution saving throw, which is the least ideal saving throw that you want to target. A lot of creatures at this level are resistant or immune to poison damage and have good constitution saving throws. So that's a double whammy of no, right? But even if you're not generally fighting creatures with poison immunity, I think you're better off taking like Stinking Cloud, which is a lower level spell, because it's going to keep them busy. They'll lose their action if they're in Stinking Cloud and fail their saving throw. Especially if you're fighting a large creature with a lot of hit points, it doesn't make sense to use Cloudkill on them because it's only going to take a little bit out of them, and if any, right? So might as well use Stinking Cloud and take them out of the combat for a few rounds. Now, don't get me wrong, the damage over time does add up, but damage doesn't affect a creature's ability to put a lot of hurting on your group, where losing their action does. So Stinking Cloud is a good option instead of this at a lower level if you wanted to do something like that. The fact that this spell provides obscurement, it's a nice addition to the damage, and it can help with tactics and even prevent an enemy from attacking you at least for 1 round because they can't see you, right? So I think the best use for this spell is fighting a bunch of creatures with a lower amount of hit points who are not resistant or immune to poison. Then you can just kind of put the cloud on them and let it kill them on its own while they're just trying to get away and coughing and all that stuff. So they'll die in 1 or 2 rounds, let's say. If you can't kill a creature with Cloudkill in 1 or 2 rounds, then I don't think it's the best option for you. I think that you're better off doing some other debuff on them or take them out of the combat with something like Hold Monster or whatever. Distance spell makes the range of this spell 240 feet, and that is a lot, so you're probably not going to really need that. The duration of 10 minutes makes this a decent way to trap enemies in a room, and then if you extend the spell, it's going to be 20 minutes, which no creature is going to survive that if they're not immune to poison. So probably not something that's going to come up, because even 10 minutes is enough to pretty much kill anything. If you take Transmuted spell, this spell becomes amazing. Why? Well, the poison damage is one of the damage types that you can change with Transmuted spell. So Transmuted spell makes this spell really, really good. You can turn the damage into something else that the creatures aren't immune to, like lightning, fire, whatever. And now you're talking about a spell that's going to be potent. So if you happen to have taken Transmuted spell, then I highly recommend this spell, because now you're going to be cooking your enemies every single round. Cone of Cold. This one is one of the few cone spells that I don't dislike. The 60-foot cone area is honestly really, really big, and you can nail tons of enemies, and it also deals pretty good damage. But I do have issues with this spell still. I know some people really like this spell because it deals decent damage, but a cone spell is hard to nail properly, and the range of 60 feet, even though that's really good, it puts you closer to harm's way than I like to be, honestly, and it's inconveniently within the range of counterspell, which is something that you're probably going to need to start thinking about at these higher levels. And when you're choosing Metamagics, from this point on, it's also too bad that it's cold damage, because that's a very fairly common resistance. You can fix that with Transmuted Spell, yes, but even then, I wish that there was more to this spell. A secondary effect really could have put this on the map for me and put it into like a strongly consider this spell option. But mostly it just deals damage, so what's the point? Why not just upcast a lower level blasting spell like Fireball or Erupting Earth or something? If you upcast Fireball to level 5, you're going to be doing pretty similar damage, but with a slightly different area of effect, but way better range. Away from harm, away from counterspell distance. So if you have Fireball, I don't recommend you take the spell at all. You can just use Fireball instead and upcast it. Unless you plan on replacing Fireball, but seriously, don't do that. It's a decent spell, even at this level. So keeping Fireball, not only is very similar in damage, but it also gives you the option of using a 3rd, 4th, or 5th level spell slot for it, for area of effect damage that you might need. Whereas if you take this and then replace Fireball with it, let's say, you're limited to just your 5th level spells. And you have to think about that, because if you're in a long dungeon, in a big dungeon where you're not getting a whole lot of rest, you use up your 5th level spell slots. That's your area of effect spells right there if you replace Fireball with this. Whereas if you kept Fireball instead, then you use all your 5th level spell slots, no problem. You can still upcast it to 4th or cast it at 3rd, still have those options available. These are the kind of things that as a sorcerer you have to keep in mind, where as a wizard you may not necessarily need to, but because you have such limited amount of spells known, it is something that you have to consider. So again, even though this spell is decent, I recommend that you think really hard if you already have Fireball in your known spells. This spell is just way too redundant with Fireball. No additional effects makes it completely pointless and redundant with Fireball to have picked this spell as well as Fireball. Plus, the saving throw is a Constitution saving throw, which is the most common saving throw for monsters to be good at, especially at this level. This means that if you upcast a Fireball, it's going to deal more damage over the life of your adventuring career than this spell will, because Dexterity is far less common than Constitution as a saving throw that monsters are good at. An even better option would be maybe take Erupting Earth instead of this spell and replace Fireball with Erupting Earth, because not only will Erupting Earth outdamage Fireball and do very close damage to Cone of Cold, it also has the added debuff of creating difficult terrain without needing concentration. That is pretty big. When with Empowered Spell, you're going to eke out even more damage with Erupting Earth and with Fireball at this spell level. But even without Empowered Spell, Erupting Earth is a generally better spell than both Fireball or Cone of Cold as you get to the higher levels. At 6th level, for example, Erupting Earth becomes strictly better than Fireball, dealing more damage and right around the same damage as Cone of Cold, maybe a 1.5 less on average, but that's not that impactful, right? Especially when you're getting that difficult terrain right around there. So with all of that said, Cone of Cold is good, but it's not mind-blowingly great either. Distance Spell doesn't even work with it. So if you were thinking, well, it's a 60-foot cone and you're within counterspell range, you can just distance spell. No, you can't, because the range is self, and therefore you can never increase the area of effect or the range of this spell like you can with other spells, unfortunately. The best Metamagic to use with this one is going to be Transmuted Spell or Empowered Spell. Careful Spell might be helpful since you're within counterspell range, so I guess that's another one that I would consider for this, but that's pretty much it. Control Winds. This one looks like a weak spell for its level at first glance, but if you take a closer look, you're going to notice that it's fairly versatile, and it's a really cool spell. It's not fantastic, but it's decent. So what does it do? When you cast a spell, you have to choose which effect you're going to produce with it. You get a choice of 3 different ones, and you can use an action to change the effect or suppress an effect temporarily if you need to. Now, I want to draw your attention to the ridiculously large area of effect that this spell has. 100-foot cube is insanely large and really allows you to control a battlefield. So let's look at the effects here. You can make gusts, which makes the winds move horizontally in one direction. This grants disadvantage on ranged weapon attacks and causes creatures to use more movement when trying to move against the wind. So if your party is facing a group of enemies, your party gets their normal movement speed, but the enemies get to move very slowly. So your party has far more ability to maneuver than the enemies do. This is honestly one of the better effects of all of them. The disadvantage on weapon attacks, it's not something that you would probably want to use your 5th level spell slot for specifically, but the movement debuff is not bad. Slowing enemies definitely is something useful, and it stacks with difficult terrain. So if you cast Erupting Earth on a group of creatures and you cast a spell the next round, now those enemies are going to be super slow while your allies are going to be moving towards them. So each 5-foot square is going to take 15 feet of movement for those enemies. That's really, really good. You can also disperse cloud effects with this one. So like Cloudkill and Fog Cloud and that kind of stuff, you can disperse it with this spell. So fairly versatile. Now, if you make a downdraft, this one is kind of like the Gust, where it grants disadvantage on ranged weapon attacks. And the main reason to choose this effect is to debuff flying creatures. You have a chance to knock them prone while they're in the area. That is pretty big. The main thing I don't like about this effect is that it doesn't make the area difficult terrain for flying creatures. That is extremely unfortunate. Generally, flying creatures have very fast movement rates, and they're going to be able to get out of the area of effect, even the 100-foot cube, within a round or two. Or if they dash, probably that round. So that's unfortunate that they didn't do the difficult terrain thing. If you choose to do an updraft, then you can help the party that's in an area where they might fall. So if you're crossing a chasm and it's dangerous, you can do the updraft to prevent any kind of bad situation from happening. It pretty much serves the same purpose as Featherfall. It also allows creatures to jump 10 feet higher, but, probably never going to use that. I wish that you could somehow use this as a reaction, but as it stands, you have to know that a creature is going to fall before you cast it, because once a creature's falling, they're going to be falling and taking the damage, and you're not going to be able to cast this spell because, again, it's not a reaction. So you have to kind of know ahead of time that this is a possibility. The spell has really good range at 300 feet, and distance spell would make it 600 feet, which is not bad. I can't think of a reason why you'd want to have that much of a range unless you're falling a really, really large distance, and then you can set it up so that it softens your fall down below. Or if you want to knock a flying creature prone or something who's flying really far away from you, you can try doing that. Clearly, the winner here is going to be the gusts of wind, because that can provide difficult terrain for flying creatures above you. It can provide difficult terrain, not difficult terrain, but it can slow down flying creatures that are above you. It can slow down creatures that are on the ground and help you against ranged attacks. So that's clearly going to be the better option most of the time. The duration of 1 hour is pretty good. An extended spell can make this 2 hours, which is really, really good, especially if you're in some kind of big war or battle or something like that. Creation. This spell allows you to create something of a specific material that is as large as a 5-foot cube. The duration of the spell depends on the type of material that you create, so this one is one that might benefit from extended spell only if you create a material that's not vegetable matter, which already is going to last a day, so you can't really extend it further than that. The casting time is 1 minute, so it's something you probably need to consider when you're casting this, since the duration of creating something like mithril or adamantine is only 1 minute. Then you're basically spending as much time creating it as it's going to last. That kind of sucks. Clearly, this is a utility spell, but I'm not sold on its usefulness, honestly. A 5-foot cube-sized item is something that's just too small for most uses, and the duration of some of the materials is a huge factor here, too. I know that some of you are going to comment that this means that you can make like a gold statue or something, or a bunch of gold, and then it's going to be worth a lot of money and you can trade it for a lot of cool items and such. I mean, sure, but how often is this going to really come up? And then also, if your character is heroic, would your character be doing something this sleazy, honestly? I mean, I guess if you're playing an evil character or chaotic character or something, and I know alignment is something most people don't play with, but if you're role-playing your character and they're supposed to be heroic, this is not something that a heroic character of mine would do. And then, the other thing on this one, you can't twin it. So, unfortunately, the only metamagic that I would even have considered to use on this would have been Twin Spell. I guess the only other one would be Extended Spell, maybe, but I wouldn't even take the spell, so I guess that's a moot point. Anyway, I think it's a very situational spell that's not good for sorcerers. Again, situational spells are not the kind of spells that you want to be taking as a sorcerer. Leave this one to the wizards or whoever else. Just don't take it. Dominate Person. Just like the 4th level Dominate Beast, but it works with humanoids instead. Because of the duration of 1 minute, clearly this one's intended to be a combat spell, but it can still serve some utility outside of combat, I guess. You can issue commands to your target, which it obeys, and then you can have them attack their own allies, let's say. It doesn't even take an action to command them, which is nice, and it boosts your action economy during a combat. So if you dominate a humanoid while you're fighting its friends, then it's just going to help your party. You don't have to waste your action or bonus action to have them help your party. It's a decent spell, but at this level, I think it becomes more of a utility spell than anything else. Unless you're playing a campaign that's really unusual, you're going to be facing a lot less humanoids at this level in combat. It's not going to be that useful there. In social interaction, this is somewhere where you're going to clearly be dominating people and making changes to... No. Clearly, in social interactions, dominating someone is something that could be useful, but the duration of the spell limits that, unfortunately. So that's kind of unfortunate. You can twin this spell, so you can control 2 humanoids if you wanted to, and you can also use Heightened Spell, and it'll increase your chances of landing this, so that's not bad. If you upcast this spell to 8th level, you can dominate the person for 8 hours, so that makes it a lot better, right? And then you can use Extended Spell on top of that, and make that 16 hours. So now we're talking something that's really going to be useful, but we're talking 8th level spell, So that's not that good. And then, of course, the ethical implications of controlling a creature for 16 hours, or a humanoid for 16 hours, it might also be too much for a heroic character, just like the creation spell, using it to cheat and steal. I don't know. This one's very rare for me to take. If I play a sorcerer, more than likely I'm not going to be taking this one. I have considered it on occasion, but it's never been my first choice. Next up is Enervation. This one is a bad single target damage spell. It's actually a bit better when it's used by Sorcerer than other casters. Your target has to make a dexterity save, which is fairly common saving throw, but not the most common. When you cast it, your target has to make a dexterity saving throw. This is a fairly common saving throw. It's not the most common. It's not like Constitution or Wisdom, but it's still somewhat common for enemies to be decent at. And then once you cast it, it lasts a full minute, as long as you can keep your concentration. It deals a very small amount of damage if the creature succeeds their save. It's 2d8 points of damage. That's horrific. And it's necrotic, which, can be pretty highly resisted if you're fighting like undead creatures. At this level, 2d8 is basically nothing. You may as well have done no damage. If the creature succeeds, you're going to deal 4d8 damage, which is still not a whole lot, and you're going to regain half the hit points that you dealt, which on average is going to be about 18 points of damage dealt. And then every turn you can use an action to deal more damage and heal some more. It kind of reminds me of Witch Bolt in the way that it works, but Witch Bolt absolutely sucks. and this one at least is not terrible. For a 5th level spell that only targets one creature, though, it is not good either. I guess if you need some healing, maybe it could be helpful, but I can think of a ton of other ways that are more efficient than wasting a 5th level spell and still having the potential to completely miss. If you really needed to heal, let's say. The range is also really bad, 60 feet. It wouldn't be an issue except that if you and your target are separated by more than 60 feet, the spell ends. So Empowered Spell can increase the initial damage and boost your healing a little bit, and Distance Spell can solve the range problem, but it's actually Quicken Spell that makes this a little bit decent for sorcerers. Every round you can use your action to deal damage and heal, all while using Quicken Spell to cast other spells and do other stuff that round. So it's a very expensive use of your Metamagic. I don't generally recommend it, but it's there and available if you wanted to. And this one is also a concentration spell, which is an issue. And basically it makes it a spell that I'd only consider if I was playing a blaster type sorcerer. Let's talk about Twin Spell in relation to this spell. If you spend 5 sorcery points, you can target 2 creatures instead of 1, making it more probable that you're going to nail at least one of them. But the issue I have here is the wording of the spell. I would recommend checking with your Dungeon Master on how they're going to deal with this spell along with Twin Spell, because there are no actual rules for this interaction. Based on my interpretation, if you land this on 2 creatures, you would only be able to deal damage to one of them on the following turn with each action. So you would only double up on the damage on the first casting if you land them both. Each additional round, what will happen is you'll use your action to deal damage to one, and then because you didn't use your action to deal the damage to the other one, the spell ends there for that one. So then at that point, you're only dealing damage to the one creature. That is my interpretation. Your Dungeon Master might interpret that differently, so check with them for sure, because you may not be able to benefit from Twin Spell like you think you should with this one. Next up is Far Step. This one's a really cool and interesting spell that conjures images of Nightcrawler from the X-Men comics for me. You can use a bonus action to teleport every round as long as you maintain concentration, which means that it's going to be like casting Misty Step every round. That's really cool. But as a 5th level spell, that seems kind of costly. So is it worth it? Let's look at the pros and cons of this versus casting Misty Step when you need it. Misty Step is a bonus action level 2 spell, which means that you can't cast it and another leveled spell on the same round. You're going to have to use a cantrip or something else, right? Take the dodge action or whatever. Far Step lets you teleport as a bonus action, and you can still cast spells that take an action every single round when you're using it, except for the first round. So that is a huge thing that I think a lot of people miss on this when they say, oh, just cast Misty Step instead. It's a cheaper resource. Well, the fact that you can cast spells even on a round when you're teleporting is huge, because you cannot do that with Misty Step if you're using Misty Step every round. Far Step also allows you to teleport up to 60 feet, which is double the distance of Misty Step. And outside of combat, this spell can be extremely helpful for exploration purposes. Now, there are some cons. Misty Step is a 2nd level spell, which is far cheaper resource than this one. In most combats, you might need to teleport only once, which means using a 2nd level spell slot is going to be far more ideal in those cases than using a 5th level spell slot. But it's not always going to be the case, so definitely keep that in mind. And Far Step uses your concentration, which in my opinion is even more costly than the fact that it's a 5th level spell. So that is also a big cost, by the way, but that's 2 big costs versus Misty Step. So what's my conclusion on this spell? I think if you're a controller or a buffer or debuffer, this spell is inferior to just using Misty Step when you need it. Because generally you're going to be concentrating on a control spell or a debuff or a buffing spell. So if you're already concentrating, you can then Misty Step and do that. Whereas Far Step takes your concentration. You're not going to be able to control the battlefield that way. If you're a blaster, though, this spell is really amazing. I always recommend using your concentration for defenses when you're specializing in blasting, and there's very little that can boost your tactics and defenses more than good mobility. So if you're a blaster, this one is really cool and it's also really powerful. I also think this spell has some major out-of-combat implications, mainly for exploration and utility. Being able to teleport up to 60 feet 10 times with one casting is nothing to sneeze at. You can get really, really far, honestly, or get atop a hard-to-reach place, or any number of other things. It's also 100 more feet than Dimension Door can get you, which is a very large distance. Not to mention, it allows for a more cautious approach to your destination, which may come in handy at times, even allowing you to double back if you need to. So if you're starting to approach a camp and you don't even know what's there, and you teleport, you get a better vision, teleport again behind a tree. Now you can see, teleport again. Oh, dang, there's a bunch of ogres there and I can't handle them. Double back, right? Whereas Dimension Door, you'll have to cast it, spend that spell slot again and again to get to that destination. So really handy there. So don't sleep on the utility and exploration aspects of this spell. It's actually really powerful. It's too bad Distance spell doesn't boost the range. That would have been really great. But outside of combat, surprisingly, and something that you may not think about, you actually can extend the range of this spell with Metamagic. But it's through Extended Spell, actually. So if you use Extended Spell, you boost the duration from 1 minute to 2 minutes. And now you've essentially doubled the distance of your teleportation outside of combat, because you can teleport now up to 1,200 feet over 2 minutes. That's pretty awesome. Hold Monster, this one is kind of like Hold Person, but it works on more than just humanoids. This one has a lot going for it, but it's not without its limitations. If a creature fails its saving throw, they'll be paralyzed and out of the combat for a round, and then they can save next round. If they fail, they remain paralyzed. Every melee or range attack made within 5 feet is going to be a critical hit, which is great against like boss monsters, and you want to kill them quickly, you can do that. The spell is good, but there are things that we really need to talk about here. First, the wisdom is a huge hindrance. A lot of creatures have good wisdom saving throws, which means that they're more likely to succeed against it than some other options. Heightened Spell can go a long way with this one. It's expensive to use Heightened Spell, but it might be worth it for a spell like this in a big combat. My issue here is that for a 5th level spell, I honestly expected more. For example, the 4th level spells Banishment and Polymorph pretty much serve similar purposes of ending the combat with just the casting of the one spell, right? But they don't grant a saving throw every round. And the 2nd level spell, Phantasmal Force, can basically do the same thing, honestly, of taking the enemy out of the combat. They don't take a critical hit when they're hit if you're casting Phantasmal Force, but Phantasmal Force doesn't grant an additional saving throw every single round unless they use their action for it. It targets intelligence, which even at this level is still a saving throw that is very difficult for a lot of enemies to pass. And generally, you're not casting this spell just so that you can do your critical hits. You're using it to take a creature out of the combat, which Phantasmal Force does better, let's be honest. So despite this, though, I think the spell has its place. If you're fighting a single boss and you can land this, it pretty much ends the combat for that creature. So, a spell, if you take it, it's not going to be terrible. Twin Spell works with this one, which at this level you're going to be spending 5 sorcery points to twin this, but even though it's expensive, it can be really impactful. But don't make it a habit, because it's just going to be a really expensive thing to do. Next up is Immolation. This one's a decent single target damage overtime spell. I'm going to compare this one to Enervation, since that's the only other 5th level single target damage overtime spell. This one deals more initial damage than Enervation, and it targets the same saving throw and dexterity. So they're kind of, this one is a little bit better in that sense. This spell also has better range than Enervation. The damage overtime element is less with this spell. You're only doing 46 versus 4d8 that you do with Enervation. Enervation also heals you a portion of the damage dealt, where this one causes the creature to shed light in a 30-foot radius. The spell grants a save every single round whereas Enervation does not. But this spell doesn't have the range limit, so if you move away from the creature, Enervation ends, right? If you go past 60 feet. Whereas this spell, you can move away and not have to worry that it's going to end. They both take your concentration, but Enervation does deal better damage type. Necrotic is better than fire damage. So which one is going to be better? I don't think you should take both, and that's why I'm comparing them, because they serve very similar purposes. So that's pointless to take two spells that do the same thing. They're both pretty mediocre. I have to say, I like Immolation better overall. And the fact that it deals damage every turn without requiring your action or your bonus action, and it frees up your action economy. And I always say action economy is one of the most important things in D&D. And it gets better because the recurring damage doesn't need an action. You can actually use Twin Spell with this spell, unlike Enervation, where it's kind of a gray area whether you can twin it. So you can twin this spell and actually deal really good damage. Yes, it's expensive at 5 sorcery points, but it's there and it can be done. There is no gray area on this one. So it's good if you're dealing with a melee that's already taking place and you don't want to do a blast spell that's going to do friendly fire. Well, this spell doesn't do any friendly fire. You can target individual creatures, maybe even twin it, and start doing damage over time. Next up is Insect Plague. This one is a really good area of effect spell that deals damage and creates difficult terrain. The range is ridiculously good at 300 feet, and 10-minute duration makes this a great out-of-combat spell to hold off reinforcements that your enemy might be sending in. Clearly, distance spell is going to make the range obnoxious at 600 feet, and extended spell is going to eke out 20 minutes out of this one. At first, it looks like this one's not much better than a lot of other spells that serve similar functions, like Cloudkill, let's say. But upon closer inspection, you can find some really good uses for the spell that others can't offer. First, the spell is going to create a lightly obscured area. This is really good if your group has a lot of ranged attackers. Unlike spells like, say, Hunger of Hadar, Sleet Storm, your allies are going to be able to see the creatures that are in the area while they're slowed down and unable to reach you. Also, the spell forces a saving throw when it's first cast, unlike a lot of spells that do similar things. This is important because you're going to deal damage right when you cast it, even if your concentration is broken afterwards. At least you got to deal that initial damage. Whereas other spells that deal damage at the start of the creature's turn, you might have lost your concentration and then you wasted a spell slot too on top of that. And third, and this is huge, this spell can affect flying creatures. That is tremendous. There are very few area of effect control spells that create like difficult terrain against flying creatures. So any spell that can do that deserves an additional look, and this one can do that. And that combined with the very long range means that this spell can really debuff flying creatures. The damage is not bad either. It's not the best, but it's going to add up if you're able to nail several creatures. An empowered spell can also help a lot here because it deals damage when you first cast it. Go ahead and empower it. And of course, distance spell and extended spell are going to be good choices here too. Seeming. This is a fun spell, if anything, but it's also very useful in a variety of situations. If you want to create complete chaos in a combat or a social situation, then this is the spell for you. What this spell does is, within 30 feet of you, you can change the appearance of every single creature. If a creature wants to allow it, it happens automatically. If a creature is unwilling, then they can make a saving throw. And the saving throw is Charisma, which is a good saving throw to target because not a lot of creatures are good at those. The duration of the spell is really good. 8 hours without needing to concentrate is amazing. And you can use extended spell to make it 16 hours. You can use this outside of combat to have your group blend in with another group of creatures, let's say. You can infiltrate an orc camp, a royal ball, or similar situation like that. You can also use it to cause confusion in those situations and then have people unable to distinguish friend from foe, which is pretty fun. You can also use it in the middle of a combat to basically pull off the same thing. So for example, if you're fighting a bunch of gnolls, let's say, and then suddenly everyone looks like a gnoll, this can create a really cool and crazy dynamic in the middle of the combat. Or you can kill the gnolls that you're fighting, then cast Seeming, and then make your group look like gnolls, and then head back to the gnoll camp, pretending like you just killed the heroes, but be able to infiltrate it without any issues. There's a bunch of cool things that you can do with this, and I couldn't possibly talk about all of them here, but this spell is one that I think if you have the spots for it, it can come in really handy. It's a great utility spell and a lot of fun. Skill Empowerment. This is one of the worst spells in the game, guys. I mean, often people overlook it because when they make a list of worst spells, True Strike and other spells take the top spot there. But in my opinion, this spell is second to True Strike as worst spells in the game. There is no other spell other than True Strike that's worse than this one. So what does this spell do? This one doubles your proficiency bonus for a skill. It sounds really good, but when you read further, you realize that the target already has to be proficient in that skill in order to benefit from the spell. So that means that at the level that you can cast this, it's going to add a +4 bonus to that skill. Why in the world would anyone use a 5th level spell slot to add a +4 bonus to one single skill? I mean, and a skill that your target is already proficient in, so they're probably already really good at it. Even at higher levels, honestly, this ends up adding a maximum of a +6. And that's at the end game. Why not just have the cleric cast the cantrip Guidance and roll a d4, which can roll a 4, right? So it can add the maximum benefit that this gets you as a 5th level spell slot. And not just that, but the 2nd level spell Enhanceability is generally a better bonus by giving you advantage. And it could equal way more than +4 in that case. Not just that, but it targets an entire ability score, not just a specific skill. So let's say you were trying to boost Investigation. A 2nd level Enhanceability will boost Intellect, so you can roll Investigation, and then maybe, what's another Intellect? Arcana, right? All that with the one casting of Enhanceability. This spell, Skill Empowerment, will only boost Investigation and nothing else. I mean, why in the world would anyone take this spell? It's mind-blowing to me how bad this one is. I wouldn't even, I mean, don't take this spell. I'm not going to talk about Metamagic that works with it because you shouldn't be using Metamagic on it. You shouldn't even be taking this spell. Synaptic Static. Okay, now we're talking here. This is a great blast spell. If you consider taking Cone of Cold against my advice, look at this one instead. This is how a 5th level spell should work. Decent damage, targets a saving throw that is not common for foes to be good at, and it has a great debuff with no concentration requirement. That is really, really good. Sure, the damage is not as much as some other spells, fine. But this can be deceiving, honestly, because it targets intelligence. That means a lot more creatures are going to fail their saving throw and take the full damage that you roll versus something like a Cone of Cold, where there's a higher chance they're going to succeed their save and only take half of that damage. Cone of Cold deals great damage, but a lot of creatures are going to take only half of that. This spell deals mediocre damage, but a lot more creatures are going to take the full damage. That means that this is going to deal more damage than Cone of Cold. Very deceptive, but it does that. And it deals psychic damage, which is way less resisted than other damages like fire or cold. Again, Cone of Cold, they might succeed their saving throw and they might be resistant to cold. Psychic, very unlikely. So Those two things combined mean that you're going to be dealing close to or more damage than Fireball or Cone of Cold at this level. Now, Cone of Cold does have a larger area of effect, but I have found that generally the difference between a 20-foot radius sphere and a large cone is not as impactful in practice as it looks on paper. Not to mention the range of this spell is going to keep you at a safer distance and avoid counterspell. Beyond damage and beyond range, the secondary effect of this spell is nearly game-changing. In fact, if this spell dealt no damage at all and just had that secondary effect, I might still consider taking this as a 5th level spell. That's how good it is. The spell lingers, requiring an intelligence save every single round, and the best part is that it doesn't require concentration. So let's recap everything this spell has going for it. Great range, great area of effect, targets the most ideal save, decent damage, great damage type, excellent secondary effect, and lingers without concentration for the effects. This, in my opinion, is the perfect blast spell. If you're considering one area of effect blast spell for your sorcerer, this is the one that you should consider before any other one. Telekinesis. This one's a really powerful spell as well. 60-foot range, 10-minute duration with concentration. You can lift a creature up to huge into the air, and they have to do a contested check with you. They roll strength check, not saving throw. You roll your spellcasting ability as a check, not a saving throw. That means that you do not add your proficiency bonus to this. You can also move an object up to 1,000 pounds, up to 30 feet, but not beyond the range of the spell. Distance spell could be really, really awesome here. You can also move an object that's carried, but it also requires a contested abilities check. This one could be really awesome, especially against spellcasters. They're generally really bad at strength checks, so you can move their spellcasting focus or component pouch away from them, and they're going to have to roll a strength check, which they're going to suck at, against your spellcasting ability. There's a big chance that you're going to be able to do that. So if you want to debilitate spellcasters, this is an awesome way to do it, is telekinesis. And there are, of course, so many other out-of-combat things that you can do with this utility, move stuff around, and I mean, just so much stuff. You can help maneuver your allies as well with it. A really good spell, very versatile inside and outside of combat. I do highly recommend telekinesis. Teleportation Circle. This one is a utility spell that allows for quick travel. It opens a portal that stays open until the end of your next turn. Probably not the best way to teleport while in combat, since creatures that you're fighting can also go through the teleportation circle, so it's mostly going to be out of combat. You can teleport only to a predetermined circle, and you only know 2 locations initially. You can also make a new location, but I mean, it's going to take a year, and you have to cast a spell every day, so you're going to have to stay in that area for a year. I don't know. Unless your campaign enables this type of thing, I don't think that that's something you're going to be using. So, whatever. It's more of a utility teleportation than anything else. Basically, avoiding long distance travel. Next up is Wall of Light. This one is one of the few wall spells that you get. The Sorcerer spell list has a very limited number of wall spells, and there are only 3 available to you by the time you can cast 5th level spells. One thing I recommend that you keep in mind is that wall spells are primarily control spells above anything else. Some may deal damage, some serve a utility function, but all of them are control spells first. I generally don't judge wall spells based on the damage that they deal because of this. Generally, if you cast a wall spell, it's to separate groups from your group or groups of enemies from each other, This separation then can help your party focus fire on a smaller group and then deal with the others later, or cast area of effect on those other creatures later. This wall is a little bit different than your typical wall spell. This one can help separate creatures by blocking them from seeing creatures on the other side, but creatures can still move through it without any ill effect. So what's really the purpose of this spell? There are a few use cases. Honestly, a lot of them are very situational. For a sorcerer, that's honestly a really big downside. For example, if your group is facing a long corridor, you can lay the wall down on the ground and illuminate the corridor. Any creature that's trying to get to you is going to take damage if they end their turn in the corridor. Or you can create the wall overhead if you're being attacked by like flying creatures. They won't be able to see you. They'll have to fly down into melee range in order to see you. That could be handy. Or if you're fighting giants or large creatures that are really tall, then you can create the wall above the head of your heroes. They can't see you, so they're attacking at disadvantage, and they're taking damage every round because the wall is going to be going through them. So that's another option. You can also cast it right in front of your allies, and they can move through it, attacking creatures on the other side, and then move back at the end of their turn. Kind of like a strategy that I use with Fog Cloud, let's say. But if the creatures try to move through the wall to get to the heroes are going to be right there, so the creatures might find themselves blocked by the party, and then have to either end their turn taking damage, or move back taking an opportunity attack. So, as you can see, there are some very specific and circumstantial uses for this spell. The other thing that you can do is you can make the wall appear in front of you with its length reaching up to the sky, and then you can hide behind it and then move 5 feet to see targets that you're going to attack, then move back behind the wall. I mean, I guess, but there are lower level spells that will let you do that. You can also use the wall to shoot like a beam of light as an action and damage targets, and that can work. I mean, the damage is kind of low, but, I guess it's radiant damage, which is, in my opinion, the best damage type in the game. So that's not bad. Now, it takes an action to shoot the ray of light, which is unfortunate, but it does make it handy for a sorcerer with, say, Quicken spell, which you can then use the action to shoot the beam and then quicken another spell each round. But if you're going to be doing that, why not just cast Storm Sphere instead, right? You can use your bonus action to shoot a lightning bolt with Storm Sphere, same range, 60 feet, and deal damage, and then still have your action available to cast normal spells every round. I wouldn't count on the blinded condition to land very often, mostly because it targets Constitution, and a lot of creatures are good with Constitution saving throws, but at least the wall blocks vision from one side to the other, so you can count on that for tactics and stuff. Overall, I do think this spell has its uses, but I feel that there's better options out there in most cases. For Sorcerer, situational spells like this are not really a luxury that you can afford to take, unless you're like a Clockwork Soul or Aberrant Mind Sorcerer. And finally, we have Wall of Stone, another one of the few wall spells that you get, and this is one of the better ones. You can make a solid wall that's going to separate groups from each other, or you can shape the wall to encase a creature within it. A really cool aspect of this spell is that you can shape the wall pretty much any way that you'd like, so you can actually encapsulate yourself in a stone dome if you want, and you're going to be safe from attacks, and then you can leave some holes that you can see out of so you can still cast spells through it. Or you can even use it to encapsulate a creature and pin them against the wall, let's say, but that does require a saving throw if you were to do that against a creature. It's a great spell to use against, say, a beholder, because the wall is very specific in the spell description. The wall is non-magical, and therefore it's immune to the central anti-magic ray of a beholder. Very important. Dispel magic also is not going to be able to be used against it because it is not magical. This spell has some utility uses as well. You can shape it however you'd like, so you can make it like a long stairway going up to reach higher ground. It's also neat that it becomes permanent if you concentrate for the full duration. That's interesting. And there are a ton of other things that you can do with it. The wall itself has a great damage threshold too, so if creatures are trying to break through it, it's going to take a long time for them to do so. Its extended spell is kind of a weird choice for this one. I can only think of ever needing to use extended spell if you don't want the wall to become permanent, because it's going to require you to concentrate for a longer amount of time before the wall becomes permanent. So if you didn't want it to become permanent, use extended spell so you can concentrate a little bit longer and then not have to worry about becoming permanent. In a way, extended spell actually makes this one less likely to become permanent than if you didn't use it, right? It's a very interesting spell. It's a very versatile spell, and unlike Wall of Light, there are enough uses for this one that can be helpful in just about every game session. So really the opposite of Wall of Light, which is circumstantial, this one is versatile, right? Very good spell, highly recommended. All right, guys, we made it through the level 5 spells. I'm going to now list all the spells and which ones I think are good choices, which ones are highly recommended, which ones I think are probably very conditional choices, and which ones are bad. And that does it for today's video on 5th level sorcerer spells. I know this was a long one as well, but starting with level 6 spells, it's going to be a little bit shorter because there are a lot less spells moving forward. And as the levels get higher, there's less and less spells for each spell level. So join me for the next one. Once we're done with the spell, for the spells videos for sorcerers, I will be starting on the actual subclass videos. So join me for those as well, coming up very, very soon. And I'm working on a book with all of this stuff for the sorcerer in it. So keep an eye out for that. Patrons are going to get free, full access to the book when it comes out, and they're going to get early access to it as well. Anyways, if you guys have anything else to say about these spells, I'd love to hear about it. Please put it in the comments below. Let me know if I got some things wrong, or if you think that I missed something very important, or if there are other uses for spells that I hadn't thought of. I'd love to hear about that as well. And if you have any other questions, leave them down there in the comments down below. Click like, click subscribe if you like this content. And as always, I am your innkeeper from the Twisted Tentacle Inn. Check in anytime. I'll talk with you then.
Oh, welcome, valet guest. Glad to see you're still staying in here, even though we recently got raided by the police. They did find their suspect, but alas, he's dead. After so much destruction caused by the police, we had to undergo some major reconstruction and renovation. We even have a brand new kid's room, which hosts a Xbox 360. I'm the funniest jokester, McJokesty. Everyone finds it funny. Funny. Speaking of funny,